Now, National Treasury will release the remaining July 2026 equitable share allocation previously withheld from municipalities. Finance Minister Enoch Godongwana says the municipal equitable share transfers will be released on Friday. Now, Godongwana explained that National Treasury is releasing the funds to protect service delivery. Earlier this month, National Treasury announced the temporary withholding of the July 2026 municipal equitable share transfers to 69 municipalities across all 9 provinces. Now, to unpack this decision, we are joined by the Group Chief Advisor at Ntiyiso, specialising in local government revenue management and governance, as well as economic development, Miyelani Holeni. Good to have you. Thanks very, very much for joining us here on the programme.
Good morning, Leanne, and good morning to the viewers.
The question I need to ask you is, did Treasury actually undermine its own credibility?
I think the fact that, Treasury had to take such a drastic step, as we noted earlier, is seeing that there's deterioration in the governance, especially in the management of finances, as well as following up on irregular or fruitless or wasteful expenditure. So in this case, there has to be something that Treasury at least undertakes as a organization or government department that is responsible for compliance, especially for the Municipal Finance Management Act. However, we also note that equitable share is an unconditional grant, which means exactly that it does not need any special conditions for municipalities to receive the equitable share. So in a way, there's a point where National Treasury is driving compliance, and on the other side, also trying to manage the fact that there should be service delivery and looking for an instrument that would be able to achieve that.
So help us understand this, because less than a month after them saying that they're going to keep the money, they then make an about turn and say, okay, we're worried about service delivery, and then decide, okay, no, we're going to pay it. So, I mean, what lesson are these municipalities learning? I think that's what's important here. Are they just going to go back to how they were running the situation, or will we see changes? Because it just seems if Treasury is going to do an about turn within less than a month, perhaps they can go back to their old ways.
And I think that is precisely the point here. There are 2 key issues that Treasury is trying to drive into municipalities. One is the fact that, compliance is sacrosanct to the governance within municipalities. Number 2 is that, the management of finances as well must also be above board. In other words, any expenditure of public funds, they must be accountable for. So I think those 2 points, we can agree that those have been registered with municipalities. However, we want to believe that municipalities do not see this as Treasury blinking first, and rather understanding that, they need to also have their way in terms of meeting their obligations. So the issue that, goes forward is, will then Treasury, as well as the provincial treasuries and COGTA departments, follow through this action? I think that is where the key matter lies, that, are they going to follow through and offer the support to municipalities so that this is not repeated? Because it is one thing to withhold funding, and another to correct the situation for the long term, as well as, making sure that it does not occur. So I think the issue that, National Treasury ought to drive in this case is to rope in the provincial treasuries, provincial COGTAs, to drive the support, through Section 154 of the Constitution, to ensure that municipalities at least follow through. The unpack municipal public accounts committees function, they process reports, they reach council, the consequences are then affected on the cases that are found to have not been compliant. So I think that's the key issue here, that compliance must be the one that, wins the day, as opposed to whether National Treasury has blinked first, or the municipalities have won and should go back to their own ways.
I suppose accountability, though, is also what we need to look at, because municipalities need to be held accountable for persistent Municipal Finance Management Act breaches. Now that the immediate financial pressure of withholding the fund has been lifted, I suppose it's a question one needs to ask. I mean, will this U-turn by Treasury weaken its leverage in forcing councils to address this irregular, fruitless and wasteful expenditure?
Treasury has a number of instruments that they can apply with regards to ensuring that municipalities comply. This one in particular was seen as a drastic one. And previously, we must also point out that Treasury has applied this approach, albeit selectively in terms of different municipalities. So this one, to apply a blanket a freezing of equitable share was a different approach that they perhaps were also trying out. But it's not about losing leverage as opposed to then driving the message across. The issue that goes forward is that there are still conditional grants that municipalities must access, and it means that then National Treasury must also be more stringent around the release of those conditional grants, because as the word suggests, there are conditions which municipalities must meet, whether it's for urban development, whether it's for rural development, whether it's for water services, whether it's for electrical services, and so on. So there are still those aspects where National Treasury can apply those instruments and ensure that through the conditional grants they are able to at least drive the message of compliance across the municipality. And the issue at hand here is that when municipalities are not paying their main suppliers, such as Eskom, such as the water suppliers, such as the AG for that matter, and we may add that they're meeting their obligations in general, the pension funds and so on. That is a discipline that they need to be at least pushed to get into, and those instruments of applying the conditions using conditional grants should also drive the message. But we still push that the National Treasury does not stop at this level, and also goes into the municipalities to iron out the issues which have gone wrong, and to correct the issues going forward through the instruments of provincial treasuries, provincial coctas, as well as other stakeholders that are available. And for that matter, audits will be starting soon as the municipalities submit their annual financials for the previous financial year at the end of August.
Well, this is, these are things that one would imagine would be a given, and that, the money and the funds given are used for the means that it is to make a better life for South Africans. And one would think, okay, now that the funds are being released, is this going to make any difference whatsoever, or is it just going to be going to unpaid salaries and huge debt bills that are coming in? We still look around and we see that so much of the work that this money is intended for is not being given the preference. And obviously one of the reasons given that we will obviously have these funds released is because we need service delivery, and yet municipalities are not following through on that service delivery. So it just seems like a double-edged sword, because what does one do, especially when you look at the massive debts for Eskom and water boards?
So the reality is that the local government system as it stands now, is not functioning the way that it should function. We have a number of areas which require attention. And the local government white paper review process is one that we hope will then start to look at how to correct the functioning of local government and municipalities in particular. A case in point is that a number of municipalities, and those who were on the list of the equitable share, of which the equitable share was withheld, are smaller municipalities, which are some in the rural areas. Yes, some may be in the peri-urban and some may be in the urban areas. But those that are in the outskirts do not have a revenue base that is strong enough. They do not have industry that is strong enough to be able to support them to generate sufficient revenue to be able to run themselves and to meet their obligations and to grow to the next level. So some of those municipalities will be hit hard because of the withholding of this equitable share, and then they will have to go and catch up with backlogs of salaries, of paying the pension funds, of paying for things that at least keep them surviving from day to day, as opposed to looking forward with regards to how do they build further in terms of making the municipalities sustainable. The ones in the peri-urban are kind of mixed, in the mixed position, because on the one side, they have some kind of an economy, but they don't have a full base where they can rely on. And the metros is, I think, the ones that, ought to look at themselves, a lot more and drive, the compliance side of things, because compliance is not a luxury. But the reality is that municipalities live from hand to mouth generally at this point in time. It may be because of, the state of the economy, but also the fact that the system is not allowing them to be able to get the revenue that they need to obtain. There's competition in some of the areas between the supply of electricity of Eskom and as well as municipalities, where electricity is a major revenue generator. Water, on the other side, there are water leakages, there's aging infrastructure. So I think we're pointing to a municipal or local government system which requires really an overhaul for it to be able to function at the point where it can be sustainable. So at this point in time, we will still see municipalities living hand to mouth until we can overhaul the system so that we are able to consolidate some of those ailing municipalities with municipalities that are perhaps stronger and have an economic and a revenue base, as well as to attract the skills that are required to run local government. That's another area that ought to be looked at, because capability, which is leadership, strategy, and service delivery, currently is at its lowest.
All right, and those are important aspects. And we didn't even get to touch on the issue of consequence management, because people have to be held accountable for not doing what they are supposed to be doing. But we'll have to leave it there, unfortunately. We wait to see, because I know Treasury has said that they could withhold that funding again if in fact this is not sorted out and they don't see that things are reversing. So this could be, again, another scene we see in December. But let's leave it there. Miyelani Holeni is the Group Chief Advisor at Ntiyiso, specialising in local government, revenue management, governance and economic development, unpacking Treasury's decision to release the withheld Municipal July 2026 Equitable Share. All right, we need to take a quick break. We'll see you shortly.